I'm Dr. Regino Ramos Jr. On a reasoned response, we provide responses from a biblical point of view to the pressing ideologies that the world presents. Recently, the National Education Association scrubbed its website because of some very harsh statements it made concerning what it would do to teachers and other school-related individuals if they refused to teach critical race theory. The rhetoric they used was so strong that it seemed more like propaganda and a way of communicating to the violent masses than to provide guidance for educators. This was more like what you would hear at a Marxist rally. But it is no coincidence that this is so, because the foundation of critical race theory is, in fact, Marxist. Join me as we study the links between critical race theory and Marxism on a reasoned response. Marxism and critical race theory. Is critical race theory Marxist? The simple answer to this is yes. Critical race theory and Marxism function from the same premises. For example, both of them function from what is called dialectic materialism. It's when two opposing forces come against each other and a struggle ensues, and because of the struggle caused by those two opposing forces, an answer comes out that is called the synthesis. The difference is that in Marxism, as opposed to Hegel, a dialectical materialism has to do with nothing supernatural, is all within the natural realm. And Marx took that idea and he applied that idea to history. And we'll see as we progress how critical race theory applies the same concept. Is critical race theory and Marxism, do they come from the same root? The answer is yes. Second premise is that there, in critical race theory and in Marxism, there is a call to some type of a revolution. And this revolution, the purpose of it is to bring about what we can say and call an egalitarian means, where everybody is the same. Not only do they have equal opportunity, which is a good thing, but they also have equality of outcome, which is something that I don't think is possible. Critical race theory and Marxism also function in this third way. The final goal of Marxism, as the final goal of critical race theory, is to bring about some type of utopian society where everybody is equal and everybody has, like I mentioned before, equality of outcome. And finally, the fourth premise that they're the same in is that both are grounded in naturalism and materialism. Marx was, in fact, an atheist in spite of his religious upbringing. But Marx believed that all there was nature, all there was this universe, and nothing beyond it. So for him, this whole struggle was nothing but a materialistic struggle. And we're going to be studying as we progress how critical race theory also has that involved in it. Now, as we continue talking about this topic and unpacking it, there are some things that we need to take into consideration. Making these four statements, these four similarities as a starting point, can sound simplistic, and it absolutely doesn't cover everything, but it is a place to start. Let's just take a notice this right here. Let's look at these, and I want you to answer this question. What is the same about these three images? Now, obviously, this is a communist Marxist emblem. Some of us that can remember back into the 1960s, remember the Olympic Games, where some of the athletes, as they were receiving their trophies, lifted up their fist. Some of us remember this from the 60s and 70s with the Chicano movement, and on and on and on. But here it is. It's a communist Marxist symbol. It's also the symbol for Black Lives Matter. You see it in T-shirts. You saw it at their banners. You saw them lifting up the fist in defiance. And then, even here, the title of this is Critical Race Theory Book Club Updated. This is from a university, a community college in California. the Palomar College. All these three symbols are the same because they're all united by the same concept, Marxism. Now let's talk about a brief biography of Karl Marx. This is important because it'll help us understand where he came from and why his ideas became so important to him. First of all, his parent, Heinrich and Henrietta Marx. The father was a successful lawyer. He was a descendant of Jewish rabbis, so he was steeped in Jewish religion. But he converted to Christianity in 1816, more likely than not because of the persecution that they were suffering at that time. If they were Catholic, it would be much less likely to be taken prisoner. If they were some other Protestant religion, it was less likely they would be prosecuted. But if you were a Jew, there was a lot of danger in that. Now, Karl Marx himself was baptized when he was 6 years old. He was educated in his home until he was 12 and spent 5 years afterwards in a Jesuit school. So you can say that Marx was definitely steeped in religion. He knew what it was. In 1835, he began his studies at the University of Bonn. He studied the philosophy of Hegel, and the philosophy of Hegel in one particular aspect called dialecticism would be something very important to him. It would play a great part in his life. He joined the young Hegelians when he was at this university. And the young Hegelians, what they did is that they criticized political entities and religious entities of that time. Now, Karl Marx was no dummy, that's for sure. Very, very intelligent person. He received his doctorate in philosophy from the University of Jena in 1841. Unfortunately, after graduation, he had a difficult time getting a job because of his radical political views. And they would only get more radical as time went on. Marx got married, moved to Belgium. He published the Communist Manifesto, and he got expelled from Belgium because of his political leanings. He moves to France and eventually gets expelled from France again because of his political views. Now, during this time, he also wrote for an organization that eventually became the Communist League. He moved to London, hooked up with Engels, and published Das Kapital. And actually, it was at London where he really began to feel the oppression that the working class had. He met a young lady that worked at the factories there in London, and he went to visit, and he saw the terrible working conditions. So undoubtedly, during this time of the Industrial Revolution, things were not great. Situations were not great in this developing type of economy, but they would get better. Unfortunately, Karl Marx did not want to wait. He saw the plight of these workers and he was deeply moved because of their struggles. And he blamed capitalism for the problems that they suffered. He focused on capitalism and economic theory. His number one enemy became the capitalist system. And he felt that if he attacked the capitalist economic system by proposing different economic theories, that he could achieve the freedom of the working class. He died in 1883 and had several of his works published posthumously by his friend Engels. And his life in a nutshell. He was born in a well-to-do family, but not high society family. He came from a rabbinical background. He knew religion. He lived in London, but he lived in poverty, usually relying on Engels and others for his resources, for his money, for food. He rejected the religious background and he held that there was no God. In fact, he believed that religion was one of the big reasons for the poverty and the oppression of the masses. It was the capitalists, the business owners that were the cause of all the suffering of the poor people, of the working class, which he called the proletariat. This particular drawing from that time period shows these two capitalist monsters wringing the last bit of energy which to them meant money from these poor workers, then discarding their bodies like so much chattel, while all their money fell into this big old bucket at the bottom. Marx felt there was a great imbalance between those who owned businesses, which he called the means of production, and those that worked there. He divided the classes in basically two groups, the group he called the bourgeoisie and the group he called the proletariat. Now, the bourgeoisie were the owners, the ones who controlled businesses, rental properties, restaurants, boarding houses, and whatnot. They were the ones that provided for the working class and charged the working class and made money off of the working class. And in Marx's mind, these were the bad guys because they were the ones making the profit at the expense of the proletariat. Who were the workers? In the eyes of Marx, these workers were being oppressed and abused by the bourgeoisie. They would work for a paltry sum, lived in squalor, lived in the most terrible conditions. Now, unfortunately, it might sound that everyone, all the industries in England at this time were like that, but such is not the case. Not all of them were squeezing their employees for every penny. Now, I must say the other thing, that in fact there were those that were doing that very thing. And those were the ones that Marx decided to focus on. Now, a principal tenet of Marxism was that eventually the oppressed workers would rise up and revolt, overthrow the capitalist owners, take over the businesses, and equally divide the profits among all the people. Unfortunately, that didn't happen. But this is a little illustration. These were the three actions that Marxism predicted that the workers would do. The workers would finally wake up. They would understand how oppressed they were. They would look at their situation and their little bell would ring in their heads and they go, this is not good. The workers would then revolt violently, possibly, because the owners would not give up without a fight. And they would take over the means of production. And thirdly, they would not only take over the businesses, but they would overthrow the capitalists and a new form of government would ensue. We have these four gentlemen from four different ethnic groups walking arm in arm, happily strolling along through this great socialist society. And I must say that in theory, socialism sounds really, really good. Unfortunately, the difference between theory and practice sometimes are not the same. This new socialist society would come into existence and it would be a socialist utopia. Now, the problem for Marxism is that this never happened. Marxism failed. It failed because the proletariat never rose in revolt. It failed because developed capitalism never created the negative environment that Marx predicted, quite the opposite. It failed because the countries that socialism was implemented, the standard of living in those nations quickly got worse and the governments quickly became oppressive. It failed because as time moved on, capitalism made the lives of a greater number of persons better. It increased the standards of living and eventually created a freer society. Yes, there are poor. Yes, there are still oppressed persons, but those numbers decreased with time. And that's one of the big issues that we have, especially today when we deal with critical race theory, with critical theory, with Black Lives Matter, with all of these things, is that they tend to focus, as did Marx, with only one small slice of the entire capitalist situation. They look at and they'll hunt down to find the most oppressive places, the sweatshops, and they'll point, see, that is capitalism. But they refuse to understand that capitalism has created a greater middle class, has lifted more people out of poverty in these last 100 or so years than any other governmental system. Now, Dr. Lee Edwards, PhD, wrote this article entitled These are the most telling failures of socialism. Now, Dr. Edwards is a distinguished fellow in the conservative thought from the Heritage Foundation, and he's a leading historian in American conservatism. He has authored about 25 books. Now, I quote from Dr. Edwards on the failures of socialism. 1. Socialism has never succeeded anywhere, including the Marxism and Leninism of the Soviet Union, the National Socialism of Nazi Germany, Maoism of the Communist China, and the Chavez-Maduro socialism of Venezuela. It has never come close anywhere to Marx's ideal of a classless society. The second observation of Dr. Edwards is this, too. Karl Marx has been wrong about nearly everything he predicted. The nation state has not withered away. Capitalism didn't break down as a result of the Industrial Revolution. The workers haven't become revolutionaries, but capitalists. The middle class hasn't disappeared. Indeed, it has expanded exponentially around the world. Marx's attempt to use Hegel to create a scientific socialism has been an abject failure. Number 3, socialism denies the existence of an essential human trait, human nature. And that's because Marxism, as is critical race theory, Marxism is materialistic. It's naturalism. Marx borrowed from the Enlightenment to declare that human nature was malleable, not constant. Christian theology, with its idea of a fixed God-given nature, infuriated Marx. The socialist state established by Lenin tried for 7 decades to create an entirely new human, the Soviet man. In December of 1991, Mikhail Gorbachev gave up trying to dissolve the world's most spectacular failure in human engineering. And 4, socialism depends not upon the will of the people, but on the dictatorship of the party to maintain power. In The God That Failed, 6 famous Western intellectuals describe their journey into socialism and their exit when they encountered the gigantic gap between their vision of a socialist utopia and the totalitarian reality of the socialist state. Now, right around this time, towards the end, 1890, thereabouts, people had began to notice the failures of Marxism, that it wasn't exactly moving as they thought that it would. So there arose other groups in different parts of Europe. For example, in England, there arose a group called the Fabian Society. And the Fabian Society was a Marxist society that was observing Marxism and wanted Marxism to become the next big governmental thing. And one of the very, very famous people in their line was George Bernard Shaw. Now, Dr. Hicks makes this observation. Marxist socialism thus faced a set of theoretical problems. And here it is. Why had the predictions of Marxism not come to pass? And that was the very struggle that the Fabians had to think about. Why? Because Marxism predicted that there would be a revolt from the proletariat. And the Fabian Society, they would think about this. Why? Where was the revolt? Capitalism would eventually implode because it would exploit the workers and then exploit capitalist business until there were only a few capitalists left and a whole bunch of poor workers. Remember, I mentioned dialectical materialism, where you have one force and a second force. You have oppressed group and an oppressor group, and they get into this struggle, and out of there comes a solution. And what Marx was saying was that in capitalism, what happens is you have the capitalist and you have the worker, and the capitalist business owner uses up the worker until the worker has nothing left, and throws the worker into the poor farm as the capitalist person gets richer and richer. Eventually, this capitalist business and this capitalist business are going to fight with each other, and they're going to also go into this conflict until one of the two wins, and one of them continues its march towards great wealth while that other capitalist person also descends down into poverty. And according to Marx, eventually there would be very few at the top and a whole bunch at the bottom. The other failure was that the middle class would eventually disappear. Now, according to Marxism, a few of the middle class would eventually move into the upper class, but the rest would descend into the lower class. But that was not the case. The middle class grew, and there were less and less people at the bottom rung of poverty. Dr. Hicks continues, after decades of waiting hopefully and pouncing on any sign of worker dissatisfaction and unrest, the plain fact was that the proletariat was not going to revolt anytime soon. Now, within the Fabian Society, this led one of the founders, a lady by the name of Beatrice Webb. Her and her husband were a couple of the founders of the Fabian Society. Her husband's name was Sidney. As a founder of the Fabian Society, they had to rethink their strategies. Okay, Marxism isn't playing out the way that it should. What can we do to make it play out? Where before, with Marx, it was about revolution and the violent overthrow of the capitalist. The Fabians saw that this wasn't happening. So they changed from revolution to evolution, the patient waiting for it to happen. But this new strategy also needed a big modification to Marxism. It's still Marxist, it still contains all the flavors of Marxism, but Beatrice Webb stated it very, very clearly in her memoirs, which were published in 1948. And this is what Beatrice Webb wrote. We, the Fabians, we have little faith in the sensual man. We, the intellectuals of socialism, is what she meant. We have little faith in the sensual man. We believe he can do no much more than describe his grievances. We do not think he can prescribe remedies. Now, to do this, they needed a strong elite. In order for socialism to continue its march, they could not rely on the proletariat. Instead, they needed to have some type of elite to take the lower class into some type of utopia. Believe me, this was talked about by Lenin and Stalin in the Soviet Union. Now, the question is about the we that Webb writes about. And what does she mean by sensual man? Well, the we are the Fabian Society or the Marxist socialist intellectuals, as we'll see a little bit later on. By sensual, she means that these proletariats are guided simply by the senses and cannot think or decide on their own, let alone plan a revolution. In her mind, and as we notice in the mind of the socialist elite, of the socialist intelligentsia, even in our time, they do not believe that the average citizen has the ability to think on their own and to decide whether they can revolt on their own. So therefore, it's up to the socialist elite to plan that revolution. Now, there was a change of strategy with the Fabians because of this little phrase that Beatrice Webb said. Remember, the ruling elite have little faith in the lower classes. The proletariat was just not able to rule itself. So it needed what Dr. Thomas Sowell today calls the anointed. Now, I must say, Dr. Thomas Sowell is an African American and he is a conservative. The anointed are the intellectual elite that know better than the rest of society. They are the messiahs of the new order. What was needed was a revolution guided by the elites. These elites, through the passing of laws, through the control of the power structures, etc., would impose socialism on everybody in a dictatorship of the proletariat, as Dr. Hicks has commented. At this particular juncture enters an Italian, Antonio Gramsci, who was an educator, communist revolutionary, an organizer, an activist, and a political theorist. Now, Gramsci held that a new person must be culturally created before the Marxist socialist state could succeed. Culturally created by the strong ruling elite. Through education in the academy, they could influence the minds of the next generation of thinkers. So in the universities, that they could be in the highest positions, if they could push a socialist agenda through courses, dare I say today, like women's studies, Latin studies, black studies, and the like, different types of philosophy, artistic critique, etc., through these courses, they found a way to reach people and to begin to indoctrinate them into their particular view. From the elite, it would go down into the academy, then to the teachers, to the students, and then to the mass of society. A top-down change. Through this education of the proletariat, they would bring out indoctrinated individuals, persons that knew the status quo and could critique it. So they figured, Gramsci thought, what we can do is among the lowest level of society, we can find some of the most marginalized people. We can take these people, indoctrinate them, run them through the educational system, help them get their advanced degrees, make them part of the intelligentsia, make them part of this elite group, because after all, they've had this lived experience. And then we can use them as the mouthpiece for the movement that we are now in. Now, another step for Gramsci was the media. Gramsci himself was an important writer for socialist propaganda magazines and newspapers. He wrote a great deal. If the information about socialism and the lack of satisfaction of the masses was kept in front of the proletariat, then sooner or later they would get it. Now, we need to understand that the written and print media of that time was very much the way social media is today. It was the way that information would get out to the most people. People would read newspapers. The intelligentsia would sit down together and they would discuss some of these articles. They would discuss these subjects. And wanting to be intelligent, wanting to appear intellectual, they would accept what was being said. The flow of information from Gramsci continued even while he was in prison for his radical views. Now enter another character, a guy by the name of George Lukács, who was a Western Marxist. Now Lukács held that traditional values had to be eliminated. He held that the destruction of society was needed to usher in a new world order. Who would create the new world order? It would be the revolutionaries. But which revolutionaries? The ones that led the revolution. These were the ruling elite of the Fabians and of Webb. Now, Lukács and Gramsci both connected in Frankfurt, Germany, where they helped establish the Institute for Social Research at Frankfurt University. And this became the seeds in 1923 of what we now call the Frankfurt School. I cannot underestimate the strength of and influence that this school has had. After World War II, this school moved to the United States, set up in Cambridge, Massachusetts. After World War II, they went back to Germany, and they also set up sites in England and in France to disseminate a lot of their ideas. Now, Lukács mentioned doing away with the old values. Now, what old values was George Lukács talking about? Remember Marxism. Remember what we said about Marx. He was materialist. He did not believe in God. He did not believe in religion. As a matter of fact, Marx believed that religion was a danger to the people. Lukács, the old values for him were the Judeo-Christian values, which included the Puritan worth ethic that had brought about capitalism. Gramsci wanted to use education and media to change the minds and to raise intellectuals. Lukács, on the other hand, wanted destruction and annihilation of these old values. Both of these came together in the Frankfurt School at the Institute of Social Research. And at this point, we end with the establishment of the Frankfurt School. At least we end this particular session. And I hope you hang on for the other sessions as we continue, because we've laid the framework and academically and intellectually for what we're going to talk about later on. Everything that we have talked about, both with Marx, with Gramsci, with Lukács, with the Fabians, is very, very important, because all of these ideas seep in and are part of critical theory. We need to know what these ideas are so that when we look at critical theory or when we hear critical race theory, we're able to understand where it's coming from and what they really mean by the words that they use. Now, the Marxist concept and ideology is what formed the Frankfurt School in the early 1900s, 1923 through the present. Some of the prominent people theorists in the early Frankfurt School was Max Horkheimer, who wrote Critical Theory, Theodor Adorno, who wrote Culture and Industry, Herbert Marcuse, who wrote The One-Dimensional Man, and Jürgen Habermas, who was a second-generation Frankfurt School who dealt with the public sphere. Now, we talked about how the Fabians wanted to move from revolution to evolution, but Gramsci and partially Lukács also ushered in another movement. Whereas to Marxism was primarily economic. They moved it into the social arena to social Marxism, and Gramsci even one step further into what we call cultural Marxism. I'm Dr. Regino Ramos for A Reasoned Response. Please join me for the next edition where we will continue to